This video is not a review of Limbus Company. I don't feel like I've played it enough to be qualified to do a proper review. Instead, I want to talk about my experience with the game, and why it failed to capture my interest. The Project Moon sleeper agents are probably going to send a pipe bomb to my mailbox for this, but the truth of it is, I found myself bored for most of the time I played it. Why? Well, the combat of Limbus Company is actually rather unique. Almost too unique. You literally chain together these skills, and then you watch as all of your units clash with the enemies. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to intuit what these skills mean or what they will do to affect the battlefield, as opposed to any of these other ones. That's not even my biggest problem, though. That would be the literal win button.
My manager will learn the game mechanics and make thoughtful decisions to beat every encounter.
For the vast majority of the early game, as long as your characters are sufficiently leveled, you can just steamroll everything by hitting the win button. I know there's a lot of depth to be had with this combat system, but quite frankly, the game does a terrible job of explaining itself, and also doesn't ever really put you in situations where mastery of game mechanics are required to continue. At least, not in the early game. You know, the part of the game where players are supposed to be learning how to play it? This is one of the same problems I had with Nikke. Sure, the game might have depth in its mechanics, but if the vast majority of the content can be cleared on the first try with auto battle, in my opinion, something isn't right. The primary role of auto battle, in my opinion, is to reduce grind or take care of stuff you've already moved on from in terms of progression, and not the primary way the game should be engaged with, because it's not engagement. It's watching a glorified cutscene simulator. Going back to Limbus Company, because the game doesn't take the time to layer on its mechanics one by one, or require you to actually master its gameplay in order to progress in the early game, when the time comes that I actually will have to get good, it'll be less of a learning curve and more of a learning brick wall. And in the meantime, while I wait for the game to actually get to that point, I'm bored out of my mind watching my team win yet another pointless combat encounter. Honestly though, I think I could have pushed past this had the game's writing captured me in the early game, and I think you can guess by now that it didn't. I know, the game supposedly has some of the best writing in not just gacha games, but video games in general. The problem is the early chapters really suck. While I do think part of this is my personal taste, part of it also stems from issues that I think would weaken the story of any game. First and foremost are the characters. If there's anything that Ruby has taught me, is that it doesn't matter how shaky your series' plot is if your character writing and design is good enough. In Limbus Company, right off the bat, they dump something like a dozen characters onto you all at once. In my opinion, this is a massive blunder. You hardly know any of these people, and yet the game expects you to care about them because... yeah, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. It would have been far more effective if you were introduced to these characters in batches of 3, maybe 4, and give them at least a little bit of screen time to help firmly establish their primary character traits and relationship with the player character before onboarding more of them. This doesn't even have to be that long of a process. In Honkai Star Rail, you're constantly being introduced to new characters, but because they do it in small batches, it's a lot easier to keep track of who they are and why they're significant to the story. Limbus Company does start to have a focus on individual characters from the second chapter onwards, but that leads me to my second problem. I just don't really like any of these characters, with the exception of maybe Faust. Part of it is probably a side effect of the grimdark setting. Basically, all of the early game repeatedly shows these characters being little more than thugs who are good at beating people up, but abysmal at following directions, and they're constantly at each other's throats. I don't mind there being darker elements in stories. In fact, a lot of my favorite series can get quite dark and depressing. However, the problem with grimdark settings is that when everyone's an a-hole and everything is bleak with no hope or sense of purpose, it's hard to care about... well, anything. It really wasn't until about Chapter 3 that I gained any kind of desire to know more about the characters and the world building, but at that point, I was so bored of the gameplay that I lost all motivation to continue. All of this, of course, could have been alleviated by quality of life features that Limbus Company is sorely lacking in. A true auto battle mode, where it just selects win rate every time, would help quite a bit. But what really kills me is that the game has a sweep feature for the farming stages, it just penalizes you for using it. But why? There is literally no good reason for this. It's not like these farming stages are hard. There is basically zero chance of you losing them. So in that sense, they're already solved. Having to redo all of the work again only detracts from the experience. Seriously, all they have to do is remove the stamina penalty on the sweep feature, and this game would be really easy to keep up with, especially since there's no limit to how much you can condense stamina. Instead, though, you gotta slog it out through hours of mindless farming if you don't want to lose out on stamina efficiency. Now, could I have just accepted the stamina penalty and settled for progressing at a slower pace? Yeah, probably. But all of these issues just made it clear to me that this game just isn't for me. Which is a shame, because going into this it seemed like it had all the ingredients for a game I'd really enjoy. Also, another thing I've learned recently, pulling for alternate versions of characters really doesn't do it for me. I appreciate how free-to-play and low-spender friendly the game is, however, I found that a variant of a character has to have some major differences compared to the original in order for me to find them compelling enough to pull for. Limbus Company is still a fantastic game, if it manages to click with you. Unfortunately, it just didn't for me. And that's why this is not a review of Limbus Company.